Hello and welcome to Analysis. I'm Jonathan Steele. The arrest and charging of British activist Moazzam Begg over alleged terrorist-related activities in Syria has reignited the debate in the United Kingdom over the flow of European and British citizens to Syria. In particular, concerns have been raised over the ability of volunteers to travel to Syria with charities and NGOs and then join rebel fighting groups who are fighting against the Assad regime. But considering the difficulty in negotiating the political terrain in Syria, is it realistic to expect charities to scrutinize their volunteers for potential fighters? Flaminia Jambalvo has more.
Holding prisoners is
Moazzam Begg, a former Guantanamo detainee, is to appear in court on Saturday after he was charged with terrorism offences connected to Syria. Mr. Begg, a vocal campaigner against UK government's complicity in controversial counter-terrorism measures, such as rendition, is accused of providing terrorist training and funding terrorism overseas. Moazzam Begg is due to appear at the Old Bailey on the 14th of March, alongside Jerry Tahari, a British citizen also accused of funding terrorism overseas. Begg was held by the US government at the Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba for nearly 3 years and released without any charge in January 2005. He always maintained that he has never been involved in any kind of terrorist activity. These recent arrests have reignited the debate in the UK over the issue of radicalization of British citizens fighting in Syria. In a recent interview with the Evening Standard, counter-terrorism chief Charles Farr said,
"Syria is different from any other counter-terrorism challenge that we have faced since 9/11. Because of the number of terrorist groups now engaged in the fighting, their size and scale, the number of people from this country who are joining them, ease of travel, availability of weapons, and the intensity of the conflict."
Ministers are also passing a new set of laws to deal with these alleged security concerns. Home Secretary Theresa May has already used prerogative powers to confiscate the passports of potential fighters. Home Office ministers are also seeking to reach an agreement with internet service providers to monitor and block the sharing of extremist material on social media. These measures have come under fire by a number of human rights organizations, including CAGE, an NGO that campaigns against the excesses of the war on terror. According to CAGE, these measures are in breach of human rights and could lead to the conviction of humanitarians delivering much-needed aid to ordinary Syrians. In a speech in the House of Commons, Home Secretary Theresa May stressed for the need for greater humanitarian aid to Syria.
More than 100,000 people have been killed, and the credible reports of systematic use of torture and starvation are simply sickening. Millions of innocent people have fled their homes. There are now more than 11 million Syrians in desperate need, including 6.5 million people displaced inside Syria, and more than 2.3 million refugees in neighbouring countries, at least half of them children. The numbers are staggering, and the scale of the crisis is immense.
CAGE has also stressed that while foreign fighters, including British citizens, have been fighting alongside Syrians for over a year, there has not yet been any act of terrorism carried out on British or European soil connected to Britons returning from Syria. As the Syrian conflict continues to escalate, the international community is looking at ways to ease the suffering for some of the country's most vulnerable people. Whether the UK's security concerns will affect the future of humanitarian efforts and hamper civil liberties remains at the heart of this debate. Flaminia Jambalvo, Islam Channel.
Well, joining me in the studio to discuss all this is Kerry Boulevant, who's media officer at CAGE, Hakan Kamuz, who's legal representative of the Humanitarian Relief Foundation, known in Turkish by its initials IHH, and on the phone we have Margaret Gilmore, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to the programme. Well, Kerry, Hakan, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. You run a charity which is helping in Syria. I mean, how can you be sure that some of your people aren't actually helping fighters or even being fighters themselves?
Very simple. There is no evidence of such an activity at all. They're just trying to scaremonger everybody into thinking anybody who helps Syrian refugees or those who suffer in conflict, branding them terrorists. I mean, in your piece at the beginning, the head of terrorism unit in Evening Standard calling all those who are helping them terrorists is a clear example of usage of language to somehow dehumanize all those people who actually help Syrian refugees either inside the country or outside the country. And the way they somehow portray it is if you actually do help them and challenge our policy in what we do, which is an atrocity, and they literally facilitated. British government is complicit in this. Then we will call you terrorist. We will take away your passport. This is pure fascism practiced by Theresa May, and it's an Islamophobia that you don't expect nothing else from the current Home Secretary we have in this country. This
let me put this, this very strong point you made, but let me put it to Margaret Gilmore, who is on the phone. Margaret, do you think that there should be more oversight of these charities, and do you think it is possible that people are using charities as a cover to go and be fighters?
I definitely think there should be oversight. I don't think it's a case of all or nothing. I think there are people going out there to do some very, very good work. But there has been evidence, according to people from inside Syria who've come out, who've spoken to us here at RUSI, for example, who say that there are some people who are using the cover of some very good charitable organisations to get in, who then leave them, and then who end up with some much, much more extreme organisations. And I don't think it's true to say just because nothing has come back here, that there hasn't been any attack here as a result of people fighting in Syria, that it's not going to happen in the future. It's certainly something that the intelligence agencies and our police are extremely worried about. They're following up a huge, huge number of leads. And there are, in fact, I'm aware of 2 or 3 court cases, well advanced, going through the courts, where the very issues just raised are going to be tested. Have these people, should they be charged with terrorism offences because they have been with extremist groups abroad? And is there evidence that they've been planning attacks back here? And that will be tested under the rule of law by the courts in this country.
Well, let's separate that out. One is being associated with extremist groups abroad, and the second is the thing of coming back to this country. Let's just stick with the first part of that. Isn't there a contradiction, since the British government itself is giving what they call non-lethal aid to these groups? So why shouldn't private citizens also give aid?
Nobody's saying that private citizens shouldn't give aid, and actually UK private citizens are giving a massive amount.
No, I mean aid to actual fighting groups like the British government is doing.
Well, I think there's a huge extreme of groups, and that's part of the problem. The British government is trying to give aid to help ease a humanitarian problem largely to people who are not linked to extremist Al-Qaeda-style groups who are carrying out terrorist attacks and have an ideology that is both anti the moderates, the Free Syrian Army and people like that, anti the moderates fighting the government in Syria, but who are also anti the West.
Well, Kerry Bullivant, let me come to you now. I mean, do you think that the charities are being used as a cover?
I would agree with Hakan that there's very little evidence that there's anything like that going on. In fact, from our investigations on the ground, we've had journalists working and investigating this particular issue. And some of the commanders spoke to the journalists and said, look, we have told people that are coming to us that if you came in with charities, then go away, because you had a covenant and a treaty with them to stay with them. So you can't break that and then come and join us. So if they've come in with charities, they're even being turned away. We don't feel that this is really a truthful basis where the government are coming from here. The government was very happy to let people go and fight in Libya. There was no talk of blowback, and there was no repercussions for those that did. In Syria, for the first year and a half of the conflict, they were fine with it as well. Now there seems to have been a U-turn in policy, and suddenly there are arrests flying around all over the place.
As many people going into Syria from Britain as went to Libya, isn't it that the position has become much bigger now?
I think if you listen to the so-called counter-terrorism experts, whether you have a very large number of people going and getting involved or a relatively smaller number, you would say that there's still the same issues abounding here, i.e. training and so on and so forth. But yet there was no issue there, and there is an issue here. There's no evidence to say that there'll be blowback. Even the deputy director of MI6 said that the idea of blowback comes on a theatre-by-theatre basis, i.e. that in certain instances there have been problems, i.e. for example with the American-Afghan situation, but in Bosnia, in Chechnya, there was absolutely no blowback, and we've seen none from Libya. And to be honest, from all empirical evidence, there's no sign that there'll be any blowback from Syria.
Well, Hakan, do you think that there's a risk of blowback?
No, what is shameful here is how governments currently using the situation in Syria to bring about this arbitrary arrest of Mozambique for no reason whatsoever, although they've charged him and he will go through the legal processes. This actually then equates it with what George Orwell did in the Spanish Civil War, or why don't we call Lawrence of Arabia terrorist? Because he went to Arabia to see the people, and then all of a sudden he joined their cause. And you know, and they proudly present him fighting with Ottoman forces at the time with a sword in his hand. And this country happens to be so proud of that act, and it's a heroism. But now the same mentality portrays what happens in Syria and those brothers and sisters who help in Syria, and they're ready to brand them as terrorists. That's a hypocrisy of the current government. And this is illegal, unethical, and it's just wrong. And there is no evidence that they base their argument on to portray all these people. They will train in Syria, come back, and that never happened. This is a very Machiavellian way of scaring people, demonizing Islam, and all those people who actually fight for helping those refugees and somehow dehumanizing them so that they can create public opinion about them.
Well, Margaret, I mean, on the blowback point, I mean, Carrie said that the head of MI6 has talked about it being a theatre-by-theatre thing. I mean, it's in Iraq, Britain was helped to overthrow a regime, and in Afghanistan it's been involved against the Taliban. I mean, in Syria, the British government is more on the side of the insurgents. So why should there be blowback from people who are also on the side of the insurgents who go out from this country?
Look, the government is on the side of anyone who goes out and helps on the humanitarian side, and what they're doing is amazing because there's a terrible, terrible humanitarian disaster unfolding there of, terrible proportions. But this isn't about the people who are doing that. This is about very some of them to Al-Qaeda, some of them with that type of ideology. And there is evidence on the internet where they're boasting the types of things they're doing, where they're all fighting each other, where some of them are actually fighting with groups who are fighting the moderates that the British government is trying to support. And that's what's different about this arena. First of all, I would say that if you look at Iraq, yes, there were cases where people went out, learned the art of terrorism out there and came back here. I'm thinking of the people who tried to bomb the Tiger nightclub and then went into Glasgow airport, for example. So it's not as if it hasn't happened before. Of course, there has to be evidence, and we're told that that evidence is going to be emerging through the courts, through the process of law. Let's see if that happens. But I think there's a huge difference here in the numbers going in. The fact that we don't have people inside Syria in the way there were people inside Iraq, for example, and the numbers going in are far greater. And also there is no clear one opposition group. There's a whole spectrum of people who are pretty moderate but desperately trying to look after their local people and communities, right through to extreme groups who've come in, some of them from abroad, who are exploiting the situation.
Isn't there a risk that this clampdown on people going to Syria, even though the government tries to make a distinction between humanitarian aid and people going to fight, will nevertheless have a negative effect on the amount of aid going in? People will feel wary in case they're accused of being terrorists when they're just driving a truck with aid or something of that kind.
And I think people who are being stopped as they come back, if they can say, yes, I stuck with this group and this group will vouch for me, I went in with them, I went out with them, they will be released and on they will go. I mean, that's my understanding of what is going on. And I don't
then we have a police state. That's what it means. We have a police state who's policing everybody and what they're doing. That's what that means, Margaret.
And Kerry, I think you were actually stopped yourself, weren't you, taking aid?
Yes, I was stopped at the Turkish border and not allowed into Turkey on an aid convoy. And this idea that okay, they're going to stop everybody that comes back.
But you were stopped by the Turkish police.
Yes, I was stopped by the Turkish police.
You weren't stopped by the British going there or coming back?
No, I wasn't. I had issues at the Turkish border from an earlier incident a few years ago. But the fact is that this idea that, look, we'll just arrest everybody that comes back and then we'll try and filter through the ones that we should release. Well, that's not the way that police work should be done, the way investigations should be done. The fact of the matter is that people should be innocent until proven guilty. If they've gone out there on a convoy, unless there's evidence that they've committed some sort of crime, it's not the impetus is not upon them to prove their innocence.
Well, Margaret, I think we might have interrupted you in the last answer because you were talked over. Do you want to just finish the point you were making?
To be honest, I can't remember what it was, but I don't think they're stopping everybody. That's the whole point. I mean, we've had people coming in and out to talk to us here to try and give us some kind of clarity on the situation. The situation is dreadful on what's going on there. And they are able to go in and out through their own routes without being stopped, but it's highly dangerous, that is for sure, and it's a mess. And because of the fact there isn't any proper law or order there, the whole thing is very, very murky, and it's very difficult to sort out who's going in legitimately because they genuinely are helping and who isn't.
And do you think the British government is now a bit more clear about what itself is doing and that it's more clear that the aid, the non-lethal aid it's giving to fighting groups does stay with the moderates? Because you made the distinction.
I think they need more. I think the moderate groups really need to keep together as much as they can and also umbrella together much more so that they are more coherent, so that they can audit where the money is going and what it's being used for and prove to the countries that are providing that money, what's happening. Now, that's a very big ask when you're in a situation where people haven't got access to food, haven't got access to medicine, and you're saying, let's audit it, make sure the money's going to the right place.
I mean, I just want to make a comment about what Margaret is saying. With all due respect, people in Syria or those who are trying to help those refugees from Syria do not have the luxury of classing people as either moderates, mild moderates or extremists and such. There are a lot of people who are trying to fight the brutal regime of Assad, who every day is slaughtering innocent Muslims, women, children and like. And everybody who can fight against this brutal regime, they are fighting against this brutal regime. I don't think sitting here in London we have the luxury of somehow classing these people whether we like them to be extremists or not. What's the issue here is, are these people and what they're doing should be a cause for a UK government to brand people terrorists and arrest people like Mozambique, who is part of the occasion that we're talking about here. That is what we're debating here, and that is just wrong.
We're not really debating the case, and we cannot actually go into the Mozambique case because it is obviously still sub judice. But I think we've come to the end of the first part of our programme. In the second half, we'll be talking about the whole relevance of the Spanish Civil War to this and what George Orwell was doing and what is the difference now. And so stay with us, and thank you, Margaret Gilmore. I know you have to go, and Hakan Kamuz as well. But stay with us for the second half.